Today we're talking about agency database backup and maintenance. It's a really important topic. Today's class is geared toward the database administrators at your database administrator at your office, and it applies equally to those agencies that use TRAMS back office, those agencies that use client-based Windows, and of course agencies that use both TRAMS back office and client-based Windows. We're focusing on the database, the actual data file where everything's stored. And if you use TRAMS back office and client-based, it's actually one database. TRAMS and client-based share a single database. First of all, why backup? Why do you want to back up your database, and why do you want to make sure you're doing it properly? And quite frankly, it's because your agency's database is one of your most important assets. TRAMS is built on a world-class database engine. Data loss can happen for many reasons, both avoidable and unavoidable. A few examples that I've seen in the past: computer hardware failure, if the hardware that your computer's, your hard drive or the server itself, something happens to it. Database corruption, and that can happen for several reasons. Quite often, database corruption happens when you're if the power's cut off to your computer unexpectedly, or you have a power surge, fire, flood, and other natural disasters. So often when people think of data loss, they think of something just happening to the hard drive. But don't forget, if anything happens to the building where the server is located, that can cause some problems as well. Unfortunately, there's always the risk of theft. And probably the most common reason I see people need to restore data is simply because of user error. Somebody made a mistake that you need to go back on and fix. Having a reliable backup plan in place and having a tested reliable backup plan in place can help mitigate these risks. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what considerations do you want to make when you're planning your backup, and how can you test it to make sure that it is indeed working. When we talk about backing up the TRAMS database, we're talking about a specific process. It's running the TRAMS backup utility. One of the programs that's installed along with TRAMS back office and client base is a special backup program. And it's important to understand when we talk about backing up the TRAMS database, we mean running that program to create a backup file and then saving that backed up file to a secure place. Sometimes agencies will have a whole server backup in place, where they have a process where the entire hard drive that your database lives on is backed up, along with anything else. So if you have documents stored there, those will all get backed up. And that does back up your database, but it's not the full process. It's important to run the TRAMS backup program to create a backup file and then to back up your data. And you want to do that for a few reasons. In addition to creating the backup file for storage offsite and to keep safe, it actually processes and cleans up the indexes and fragmented files. It actually is a database cleanup routine in addition to backing up your database. During the backup process, the file is verified to ensure it's complete, kind of proactively checking for any possible corruption. So it's really important to run the backup utility somewhat regularly. When we're talking about running the utility, you'll see that there are two different types of backups. We have full backup. That's a traditional kind of backup where you run the program and a snapshot of your database is saved. It's saved, and if you ever need to restore it to that point, you can easily restore it to that point in time when you ran your backup. Incremental backup, which sometimes you'll hear us call a dump, consists of two types of backups that run in tandem. You have a full dump or a full backup, and then you have incremental backups that take the changed data since your last full backup, your full dump, and copy over the changed transactions. So which type of backup you use depends on your agency's transaction volumes and resources, really. Full backups are straightforward to restore, but they may take a little bit longer to back up depending upon the database size. Every time you run a full backup, you are creating a copy of your entire database. With the incremental backup process, they're a little bit faster, as only new information is copied over to the database. They're a little bit more complicated to restore, And you have to have all of the files available for restoration, both the original full backup and any incremental backup files. We recommend every agency make a full backup daily, at least daily. If your agency is particularly busy, you have a lot of transactions going on in trams and client base, you may want to consider also integrating the incremental backup to happen throughout the day. And that brings me to the next point. So how often do you want to back up? Because they can, backups can take a lot of resources because we are touching every record, every bit of data in the database. They can kind of bog down the system. So you want to think about, when do you want to run your backup? It is possible to run a backup anytime. It doesn't matter if anybody's using trams or client base. You can run a backup at any time. But since the backup can be resource intensive, a lot of agencies prefer to run at least their full backup after hours. And I'm going to be showing you in a moment that you can schedule your backup to run on a scheduled task. So if you want it to run in the middle of the night when nobody's in your office, you can do that. And that's going to cut down on any interruption to your frontline users. But you also want to make sure that the backup is frequent. I mentioned earlier, at least daily. If you have a lot of transactions, you can run it more than once a day. You know, the rule of thumb for when one's considering how often do you want to run a backup is how much work do you want to have to redo if something should go wrong. Because if anything goes wrong with your database and you have a backup, you're going to have to recreate every transaction from your last backup to the time the bad thing happened. For a lot of agencies, once a day is a good medium, if you will. But pick a schedule that works for you. Certainly, I would, like I said, at bare minimum, at least once every business day. So when you're deciding what backup media to use and what storage, you have a lot of options. And the backup process simply creates a file with all of your data in it. So you can back it up to any computer media that will hold a data file. It can be a flash drive or a thumb drive. It could be an external hard drive. It can be a CD RW, as a writable CD. It could be even another computer on your network, another hard drive. You want to avoid backing up to the same hard drive as the original database, though. Right? One of the main reasons you back up is in case anything goes wrong with your computer. So if you back up your file every day, but you back it up to the same drive as your main database, and something goes wrong with that hard drive, you're really in no better position than you would be without a backup. Like I said, a lot of agencies use removable media, like a CD-RW or flash or thumb drive. If you do use removable media like that, I actually recommend developing a system of several different pieces of media. In fact, I find that 8 different disks or thumb drives is a great solution. And when I first say get 8 reusable disks or thumb drives, it sounds like a lot. But the reason I recommend having 8 of them is effectively you have an entire month's worth of data that you can go back to. God forbid anything goes wrong, you're going to be able to go back almost an entire month to find a good piece of your good database. What I do with the first 4 thumb drives, if you will, is I label the first 4 Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I have one drive labeled Monday, one drive labeled Tuesday, and one Wednesday, and one for Thursday. And then I take the remaining 4 thumb drives I have, and I label them Friday number 1, then Friday number 2, Friday number 3, and then Friday number 4. So as I do my daily backup, every Monday I use the drive I've named Monday, and every Tuesday I use the one named Tuesday, and Wednesday and Thursday the same thing. But on Friday, I'm going to rotate those 4 different thumb drives that I've labeled Friday. So for the first Friday of the month, I'm going to use Friday number 1, and on the second Friday of the month, I'm going to use Friday number 2. Third Friday of the month is Friday number 3, and so on. Why do I go through that effort? Because now, if I notice there's something wrong with my database, and I need to go back, I can restore yesterday's because I always have the one from the previous business day. Maybe the error was in that one, so I can go back to the previous business day. I can go back day by day for the previous week. And in the worst case scenario, if there was a problem last week that we didn't catch, I can go back Friday by Friday and get almost an entire month's worth of information. You're always going to restore the newest backup, but if, worst case scenario, your most recent backup is bad, you can go back step by step. I recommend keeping at least one recent backup file off-site in case of a natural disaster or a fire or flood or some sort of physical disaster at your agency location. Some agencies might make a point of taking those Friday backups and taking them home with them. Or maybe you run a special backup weekly and you take it with you, or you just take your backup with you when you leave at night. But I recommend keeping a backup off-site because just like if you back up your database to the same or you create your backup file on the same hard drive as your main database, and something happens to that hard drive, well, similarly, if you back up if you keep your backup next to the main computer, and something happens to the premises, you're in the same boat. You really don't have a backup. Some agencies use an internet-based automated offsite backup service, and these services do automatically back up your files. It's still important to run the TRAMS backup utility. Just going back to my point about you want to run the utility. Go ahead and save that TRAMS backup file where the utility will automatically back it up off-site. So if that happens to be a spot on the same hard drive, but that spot on the same hard drive is backed up, well, then you can save that file to your main computer. But make sure it's the backup file that we're going to create when I show you the backup utility that you're backing up, or that the file is what gets backed up, not the whole database. Okay, so a little bit of background. Let's talk about the TRAMS backup utility. Every time you install TRAMS Back Office or Client Base for Windows, another program is installed with it. It's called the TRAMS Database Backup. You can actually launch it from any computer from which you can access TRAMS Back Office or Client Base Windows. But I recommend doing it from the server, whatever computer functions as your database server. It's going to cut down on just things that could go wrong, right? Because if you do it from two different computers, your server and a workstation, well, you have to make sure your server is online and your workstation's online. And if you're using another computer, the Interbase version, that's the underlying database program that TRAMS and Client Base use, they have to be on the same version. And there's a few different versions of Interbase. There's Interbase version 7, 8, and XE out there. And all three are fine Interbase versions that will run TRAMS okay. But your client computer, or the computer with the backup utility, needs to be running the same or newer version as the server. Okay. So let's do a backup. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And so the backup utility can be launched from two places. If you're using TRAMS Back Office at your agency, you'll see that under the Utilities menu, there's a link to Backup, Utilities, and Backup. Okay. And that brings up the TRAMS Backup Restore. It's actually a separate program. Even if I close out of TRAMS completely, this will be running. If you're not at a computer with TRAMS Back Office, but maybe your computer has client-based Windows, you can get to the backup program, and Windows Vista and 7, just click on the Start menu and type in the word Backup. One of the programs that will come up is to the TRAMS Backup Restore. You'll see it right there. If you're using Windows XP, simply go to the Start menu and All Programs, and then in the All Programs, choose TRAMS, and then choose Database Backup. This is the backup program. It's actually a very simple program. First line is, what database do you want to back up? And most agencies have one database called TRAMS. I'm backing up a database called Training today. For almost every agency, and certainly every agency that's set up to the default, the database alias that you want to use is called TRAMS. It's the same database used to log in. If I go into here to log into TRAMS, notice here that the login dialog asks the same question. What alias do you want to use? Okay. That tells this utility which file to back up. You can see underneath it's actually referring to a database that is called training.ib. Again, for most agencies, it's trams.ib or trams.gdb. Okay. Below that, you have a couple of places to put in a username and a password. There's an option agencies can implement called EUA, or Embedded User Authentication. And not many agencies have implemented that. It's a higher level of security for your database. But more and more agencies are choosing to implement that. You can find out if it's been implemented by going to the Help menu in both TRAMS or Client Base. When you're under Help, click on About. And near the bottom, you'll see here EUA enabled. And mine says no. So that means I don't have to worry about having a server username and password. If you look down here and your database is EUA enabled, you'll want to check with our support desk for help on completing these tasks, because you will have an additional piece of information. Every TRAMS database has what we call a System Database Administrator, called SysDBA, SYSDBA. That's the master user for TRAMS. It's the one that can do everything, including backing up your database. When we back up the database, the utility needs to be able to touch everything in the database, so you have to do it as the SysDBA, as the super user. So you can see here, SysDBA is already filled in, and then my password, and that's the password for the SysDBA user. I'm going to leave the server username and server password blank. If your database is EUA enabled, you're going to have a separate server username and server password, and you'll need to fill those in. You'll see below, now the screen changes. This is actually the same utility we use for backing up your database and for restoring it. Okay. So we want to choose the Backup tab. And you can see here, backup type, full backup, full dump, or incremental dump. Like I mentioned earlier, full backup is the most common database backup method. It's the most straightforward. That's going to create a snapshot of my database as it is right now. If we're going to do a full dump, that would be the first step of having an incremental backup. I would create a full dump and run that. And then I would, throughout the day, either make an incremental dump or more likely schedule it as an incremental dump. And I'll show you how to schedule the task in just a moment. We're going to do a full backup. And you can see here Backup 2. And this is where you choose where do you want your backup file to go. This is where you're going to choose that external flash drive, or your CDRW drive, or a network, a shared drive on another computer on your network. Someplace that is not your local disk. I stress that, and you'll notice here I made an exception. I am backing this up right to my desktop. I'm backing up to my desktop, so during today's demonstration, you can see right here where the file is going. Do not back it up to your desktop. Do not save it to your local hard drive. Save it someplace that is removable or that will be separate in case something goes wrong with the hard drive. Okay. So the options, and there are a few more options down below. So the first one is to compress your backup file, and I recommend doing that. All that does is at the end, once it creates the backup file, it also zips it, so it takes up less space. That way you can fit more data on your whatever media you choose to back up to. You don't have to do that. It does run a little bit faster, but it's also going to take up more space on the removable disk. I recommend compressing the backup file. The next option is a great one for security. That's the ability to encrypt the backup file. If I check the box to encrypt the backup file, notice it now prompts me to enter a password and confirm it. If I choose to encrypt the backup file, I must know the password to restore it. If I forget the password or lose the password, that backup file is completely unusable. There is no way to retrieve the password or the data in the file without the password. Our support desk can't do it. It can't be done. So while encrypting your backup file is a great way to keep it secure, so even if somebody gets the backup, they won't be able to restore your data, get access to it. You need to know the password so you can get access to it if you need it. So if you choose that option, make sure to keep that password in a safe spot. And then we get to validate database prior to backup. The backup utility always runs some checks on your database. It checks as it's going through and backing up for any obvious data problems that it might encounter. Normally that happens during the backup process. Occasionally you'll want to validate your database prior to backup, especially if you're noticing some weird things in your data or this is the first time you backed up. You can run the validate DB prior to backup, and that creates an extra step. Before the backup process completes and creates the backup file, Trams is going to validate. It's going to scan the database for any obvious problems. The reason you might want to choose to do that as an extra step is because the backup can take a few minutes. If you have a large database, I've seen databases that take up to a half hour, maybe even a little bit more, to fully back up, between copying the data and then zipping it and then copying it to the removable drive. Well, since the validate database option happens during that process, you'd be left waiting to see what happens. If you choose to validate the database first, we're going to check the file, scan the file, and let you know if there are any issues before we go through the rest of the steps. That way you don't have to wait for everything. You can make sure it's validated properly and then move on. Okay. But again, the validation happens during the backup anyway, so you only have to check that box in situations where you have a hunch and you want a heads up on what's going on. Once you've chosen all of your options, I've chosen my database alias and my username and my password. I'm going to do a full backup and back it up to my desktop. Notice with the incremental dumps, with the dumps and incremental dumps, I cannot compress or encrypt it. Because they're fast, hot databases, in other words, they create a live database, we can't zip it or compress it. So I just want to point out that when you choose those options, those get grayed out automatically. Okay. So the options down below, create or backup now or create shortcut. If I click backup now, if you look over here, it's going to take a few moments. I have a small database, so it shouldn't take a terribly long time. But this is what the backup looks like as it's running. Depending upon the size of your database and your computer's processor, this process during this process, it might look like this program stopped running. You can see it dancing right across your screen. It's working fast here. You may occasionally notice where it looks like it's completely stopped working, nothing's moving. You may even get a little warning here that says not responding. Don't worry about that. Let the backup run. Like I said earlier, it can be kind of resource intensive. So if you see not responding or it looks like it stopped for a while, that's okay. Just let it run for a while. Now, if you come back in an hour or two and nothing's happened, then you'll want to check with our support desk. But it's normal or not uncommon for it to go to not responding, at least for a brief period. So you can see here the last step, it was compressing and then verifying. So it always does the compression and compression. It always does the verification. It's just normally it does it at the end. And you can see here I got this message backup complete. And if you look over here on the left-hand side, I have a little zip file called training.gbk.zip. That's my backup file. Okay. So I say OK. As you can see, it's certainly not hard to run this, but one thing you do is you need to know your sysdba password. You don't want everybody at your agency to know that sysdba password because it does give access to everything in Trams and client base. You want to leave that to the database administrators, the agency's owners, and so on. But you may want other users to be able to run that backup program. So we have an option here to create a shortcut. Look over here as I click on the Create Shortcut button. Notice this when I click on Create Shortcut, it's put this icon desktop. I'm going to close this. We're going to close Trams Back Office. Okay. So this backup, and it says backup and then the name of your database. Remember, I'm working with a database called Training. Yours will probably say Backup Trams. What's cool about this shortcut is if I click on it, all of my options are saved as part of it, including an encrypted version of my password. That means by creating the shortcut, anybody's going to be able to run a backup for me even if I'm out of the office, and they don't have to know the master or the database administrator password. It's going to be pre-entered. So when they click on the shortcut, they just click Backup Now, and that backup file will be created, even though they may not know the sysdba password. I feel like I should talk a little bit more about the online dumps. So an online dump is an exact copy of the database that can be created while the database isn't in use. It's what we're creating is an exact replica of the database. So you could have it on another drive accessible to your network. If you have a a busy agency, it's a great way to have redundancy, because if anything does go wrong with your server, you can easily redirect everybody back to your the dump location, and they'd be able to use it like a regular database. The initial dump file does take a few minutes, but once it's created, once the full dump is completed, the incremental dumps are very, very, very fast, because all they do is take any information that's changed since the last time you created a full dump, and just the changes go over. Since it's an exact copy and the validation does not happen during the dump backup, since it's an exact copy in read-only mode, any corruption present in the original database is going to carry over to the dump copy. So it's still recommended that you do a full backup, but having a dump is a great way to keep a backup readily accessible to your agents. Okay. If you have any questions about the dump, I recommend emailing our support desk, and we'll help you discuss the process for setting that up, because the full and incremental dump is a little more complicated to put into test. Okay, so we have a backup. We saw that it created the backup file. We even created a shortcut. A couple of considerations. If you have a sync-activated database, and your sync-activated means your Windows database is synchronizing with one of our web services. It could be client-based online, it could be client-based marketing services, or it could be with your consortium. Many of the consortia have partnerships with us where agencies synchronize their data with the web server, and then your consortium can access that for marketing purposes. Those all happen during using what we call a database sync or synchronization. If your database is sync activated, it's okay. You can still back up while everything's going. During the initial backup and testing, which we're going to go through today, especially when you test the restoration of the database, you're going to want to turn off that sync operation, and we'll talk about that. But it is important to know whether or not your database is sync activated. You can tell by going into, first of all, only client-based agencies with client-base are synchronized. And so you would go into client-base and click on Help and About Client-Base, and it will tell you if your database is sync activated. Another really important consideration is disk space usage during the backup process. That's probably one of the most common errors people encounter while backing up their database. Even though we back up the database to an external drive, or hopefully to an external drive is where you point it, you still have to have enough room on the hard disk with your database for the process. And it's going to take 1.5 times the database size to be free. So if you have a 1 gigabyte database, you have to have at least 1.5 gigabytes of hard drive space on your computer. And that's how much that means free space. You have to have at least 1.5 times the size of your database available on your hard drive. If you don't, the backup will fail, and that's because we're creating a copy of the database, and then we zip it. So we need 100% of the database size to create the copy, and then we need another 50% to hold the zip file. And then it gets copied to your media. So it's going to clear it up, but you have to have at least 1.5 times. So we went through, and as you can see, having the shortcut available makes backing up your database really easy, right? You just come in here and double-click on it. Everything's filled in. You just click Backup Now. But that still means that people have to do it. Somebody at your agency has to remember to go in and back up the database regularly. And some agencies do that. Maybe it's the last thing they do before they leave. Whoever, last one out puts the thumb drive in the computer and clicks Backup Now. But we can automate it, and this works out really well, especially if you also have it backed up to someplace on your network, to a drive that's always there. We automate it, schedule it using the Windows Task Scheduler, and that's a program that's built into Windows. To get ready to schedule the backup, you right-click on the backup icon. Forgive that. That's okay. Right-click on the backup icon and click Properties. If you notice here, the target is the path to the program that we used to back up. It's in my Program Files directory, It's called ibbackup.exe. Help if I was on the right line. There we go. Okay, and then it also has a lot of what are called arguments or switches, and these are all the options. If you notice, these are the same options that we put into the program. For example, what username? Notice the password's encrypted. That's the master, or the sysdba password, but encrypted form. So if you look at this, you wouldn't be able to log in using that, but the shortcut knows to that it's translated into the actual, in this case, sysdba password. You can see it has the alias name, and I'm backing up training. Yours will probably say trams, and the command to compress it, and so on and so forth. You want to take that line and move your cursor all the way to the end. And it ends with a quotation mark. So you want the cursor to be after the quotation mark, and then press space, hyphen, and the word auto. Okay. Notice there is no space between the hyphen. There's a space before the hyphen, but no space between the hyphen and the letter A. Okay. Once you've done that, just highlight the whole line, including the word auto. Right-click and click copy, or Control-C to copy it. You want to copy that whole line. And then you're going to go into the Windows Task Scheduler. If you have Windows Vista or Windows 7, just click on the Start menu and type in Schedule, or at least the beginning of the word Schedule. You can see Task Scheduler comes up. If you're using Windows XP, go to your Start menu, and then All Programs, and then Accessories, and then System Tools. Each version of Windows has changed the the scheduler utility a little bit. Look for the library of tasks or task schedules, and ignore the fact that I actually already have my backup scheduled to run regularly. I'm going to delete those actually. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So now you want to create the backup process or the schedule task. The schedule utility, as you can see, there are other things. For example, my Flash updaters here, that's how Adobe Flash runs its updates periodically and so on. We're going to tell Windows to run this backup program on a regular basis. So in Windows 7, on the right-hand side, you click on Create Basic Task. In Windows XP, you go up to, I believe it's the File menu, and you'll see a new option. Create a basic task. And the basic task is nice because it's a wizard. In other words, it's going to walk you through step-by-step setting this up. And we have a class that we talk about automating a few different things in Trams and Client Base. We'll give it a name, Trams Backup. And then how often do I want to run this? And I want to do this daily. And then when do you want this to run? Remember, this is something you can schedule to happen in the middle of the night if you want it to. So I could set this to run at 11:30 every night. And that way it's going to happen when nobody's in the office. And that way the backup won't slow down this computer, and it won't slow down the database for everybody. Recur every 1 day is usually what you want. And you want to start a program. The backup process is a program. And then you want to put the program in script. And this is why I like having that shortcut first, because I can just go in here and paste it. And that's going to have all of the options for me. Make sure it ends with that -auto. In Windows 7 and higher, when you click Next, you're going to get a warning that you have a program that looks like it has arguments included. Just say yes to that. That's what you want to do. Okay? It's just telling you that it sees that you have both a program and then your various options attached to it. So say yes. Okay. So you can see here my summary. My Trams backup is going to run daily at 11:36 p.m. every day. It's going to start a program. And you want to click the Open Properties dialog box for this task when I click Finish. That's because we want to set this up so it can run even if I'm not actually logged into the local computer. Right, Windows can run this program as long as the computer's turned on, but it has to be logged in. Well, most agencies know it's a good practice if you're away from your desk to log out of Windows. You don't necessarily turn off your computer, but you log out of Windows. Well, we want this backup to run even if I've logged out for the day. If the computer's turned on, or hopefully the server's turned on because that's where we're doing this, you want to choose this option to run whether user's logged in or not. Okay. And then I'm going to click OK. And now it's going to prompt me for my Windows password. This is the password I use to log into Windows in the morning. It is not necessarily my TRAMS password. Okay, I say OK. So now that program is going to run at 11:36 p.m. every day. It's going to run whether or not I'm logged in. The computer has to be turned on. And, of course, media has to be in whatever place I told the backup utility to save this. So if I set it to a thumb drive, I do have to remember to put my thumb drive in the computer before I leave. If I set it back up to my CDRW, I need to make sure there's a blank CD in the drive. Okay. Let's go back here. I'm going to delete this backup file we just created a moment ago. And now you can wait until tomorrow and see if this worked. You see right here it says last run never. Or if you can't wait until tomorrow, you want to test it, just right-click on it and click Run. And it's going to start running. Remember at the end of this, I added the dash auto as an automatic. What that means is even though this program is running, if I clicked on the backup utility here, it would pop up and it would wait for me to click backup now. It would let me make any changes. Well, by adding dash auto at the end, that tells the backup utility to just run. Don't wait for the human to do anything. Just run it automatically and create that backup file. So it's actually running in the background. Okay. You're not going to see it, so you're going to want to come back here in a little while, click refresh, and you can see right here it tells me this task is currently running. We want to get to the point where it says this operation completed successfully. Now, if it says that there was a problem, well, in that case, then you're going to want to research what happened. Okay, it's still running. So in a few minutes, we'll have a backup file. The next step is for actually testing your backup. And I recommend you don't have to do this daily or maybe even weekly, or you don't have to do it very often, but you want to do it when you're setting up this process. You want to actually test the restoration, the backup file, and then restore it to make sure that everything's working, right? Because what happens if you set all of this up and maybe something's wrong? Maybe you think you're backing it up to a particular drive and you can't find it. Or maybe you set this up with an encrypted password and then you go to restore it and you realize you typed in a password that you don't remember. You want to make sure that you can restore your data, and that when you restore your data, that everything restores properly. Okay, and it's still running. This shouldn't take too much longer. I'm impatient, so I'm going to actually back it up now manually. That way I can see with my own eyes why it's taking so long. When you run it as auto, it runs in the background. It's the same thing, so we give it a moment. So when you're getting ready to test your backup, if your sync activated, in other words, you have the sync process running, you're going to see here there's going to be a CB sync in or sync out task. Just like we created a task for a backup, you'll see one for CB sync in or CB sync out. Before you do this, before you practice restoring your database, you're going to want to look and see if it's running. In other words, next to it, does it say the task is currently running? If it is, you have to wait until it's done. Okay? You got to wait until it's finished, until it says it's completed successfully. Okay. So I don't have that, but if I did, I would look for it. There's my backup complete. I look for it and right-click. As long as it says the operation is completed, I would simply right-click on it and click Disable. Okay. Disable means it's not going to start trying to synchronize it while we're doing this process. We don't want the synchronization to happen while we're backing up and testing. Okay. So you right-click and click Disable. And then we need to go in and we need to actually stop Interbase. Interbase is the underlying database that TRAMS and client base use. Well, we're going to be copying that file, so we can't have Interbase trying to access the file that we're going to restore either. Okay. So for that, you go into your services, and depending upon your computer, it can be under Control Panel. Most likely it's under Control Panel. You might have Administrative Tools. Under the Control Panel, you see Administrative Tools here. and then you want to look for your services. There are 3 services that need to be stopped for the next step. Okay. First one is, or the first 2 are your Interbase Guardian and Interbase Server. And you see here I have 2 listed, Interbase XE Guardian, Interbase XE Server. Yours may say Interbase 7 or Interbase 8 or Interbase 2010 or Interbase XE, but you're looking for Interbase Guardian and Server. Look for them and click Stop. It's going to stop this service. Okay. They usually stop in tandem. You can see here both of them got stopped, but you want to make sure they both say stop. You also want to go down and look for the Trams License Manager. Okay. You want to stop that one as well. That makes sure nothing's going to be trying to talk to the database while we do the next step. Now we need to find my database. So I'm going to look at my alias utility here and look for the alias for whichever database I'm backing up. I have a ton of databases, right? You'll probably have 1 or 2, including your one called Trams. Remember, I'm working with my training database. As a shortcut, I'm going to go in here and copy this path. Okay, so I went in my alias utility, opened up the alias for the database we're working with. I'm going to click Cancel. I'm going to close this. And then I can go into any My Computer window, any computer window, and paste that path in. The only thing I have to remember to do is backspace. I don't want it to say training at the end. You can see here all of my databases. We're going to recreate this, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it. Okay. What you want to do is you want to look for that database that we were just talking about, my training.ib database. Okay. This is your database, by the way, on your computer. So if you want to know how big is your database so you can make sure you have enough room on your hard drive, this is where you look. It tells you. In this case, mine's 32 meg. Right? So I have a tiny database. Yours will probably be bigger than that. Okay. But you want to look for that, and then right-click on it and click Rename. And just go to the very end after the .ib. If you have an older client base or trams, it may be .gdb. We want to go to the very end and add .old. Okay? And it's warning me that we're making it unusable, and that's kind of what we want. We want this to still be here, but we don't want to affect this when we practice restoring the database. Because in the next step, we're actually going to take my backup file and recreate my training database. So notice right now, by the way, that I no longer have a training.ib. The only one I have is training.old. Okay. So once I've done that, now I can go back in and restart my services. I'm going to go into Interbase. If I knew my alphabet, I'd find it faster. There it is. Highlight Interbase and click Start. And you want to make sure that, again, they usually work in tandem, so you can see when I started one, the other started automatically. They say started. I want to go down to Trams License Manager. And I want to start that one as well. Okay. So now I have my Interbase running again. I've taken this file and I've called it training.old. Very important step. So now I want to practice restoring my database. We use the same program to restore the database that we use to back up the database. So I'm going to click on my shortcut. You can go into remember, I'm using the shortcut. You can go to the Start menu and go to All Programs and then Trams and then click on Backup. The reason I do this because it's already filled in my password if I use the shortcut. Make sure my database alias is training. I'm going to click on Restore. And then I need to restore, so I'm going to look for that file. Remember, I saved mine on my desktop. Hopefully you've saved yours elsewhere. But I'm going to choose that training file, the training.gbk.zip file. Okay. You can use the rest of these here. Notice the validate database during restore. That's similar to validating the database during backup. This just runs it again so you can make sure your backup file was good. It does take a little bit longer, but again, since we're testing, normally you'd want to check that box. That's going to give you a warning if the data looks bad. If you click validate during restore and there are any problems, Trams will flag the database with a problem so you know it. And when you log into Trams, it's going to warn you that there's some corruption. If you had encrypted the file, remember that was one of the options, was to encrypt the backup file. If you had, you need to include the encryption password right here. I didn't encrypt it, so I don't have to include the password. So I'm going to click Restore Now. Okay. So you can see here it's going to tell you your agency name and the date it was backed up. I don't have an agency name on my training database, but it would have your agency name. If you get a message that says you're restoring over an existing file, cancel. Because if you're restoring over an existing file, it means you didn't rename the file to old before. Trams is checking, the backup utility is checking to see if your database is already in that directory. It's looking to see if I have a training.ib file. So if it sees it, it's going to warn me, and that means I didn't rename it to old. Since I'm not getting that message, I know that file training.ib is not there. Okay. If you notice, the restore looks a whole lot like the backup. The only thing is now instead of creating the backup file, we're actually creating a new interbase file or database file where it should be. This is the same process you'll use if you need to change your server. Maybe you got new hardware. So you'll do the same thing. You'll run a backup on your old computer to get the file. Then you go to your new computer, and you're going to run restore and restore the file using this utility. Depending upon the size of your database, it can take a few minutes to restore. You can see mine's going pretty quickly because I had a pretty small database. Right now it's actually reassigning privileges so the different users can do what they need to do. While this is restoring, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the special situations you might run into. There are some options in Trams to purge old information. By the way, you can see here restore is complete. So we'll click OK, and we'll come back to finish testing that. In fact, let's test that, and then I'll come back to the special considerations. So now that it's restored, now you want to go back into Trams and or client base. If you use both, you'll want to log in, or at least have your agents log in like you normally would. And you want to look and see, is all my data there? Can I log in? Am I getting any error messages? If I look for my invoices, are all of my invoices there up through when I expect to see them? Are my payments there? Is everything, are my dates, is everything looking good? Go into client base. You just want to do a reality check. Chances are if you can log into your database, it's all good. But you still want to look around to see if anything looks fishy. Okay. And the only other thing left to do is if you've disabled the sync because you're a sync activated database, you'll just want to go back here. Once you've checked and everything is good, right click on it and enable it again. And let that utility run to back up your files. Okay. So that's the testing portion. And you don't have to disable the services day to day. You just want to disable them for that one step when you're going to rename the database. If we go back to that directory, you'll see I actually have two files now. I'll have a training.ib, which is my live database, and then I'll have my training.ib.old, which is a copy of that database. Now, what happens if I go through this and my restore fails for some reason? I log in and it didn't let me log in or something. Go into that directory where your database is, delete trams.ib most likely, and then simply right-click on the .old file that you renamed and delete the .old, so it goes back to being trams.ib, or in my case, training.ib, and try the process again, backing up and restoring. Okay, so never restore. Always test it out before you do it. Never assume that everything's working. Okay. Keep in mind when it comes to restoring, when you restore, it overwrites the file. So if I hadn't renamed training.ib to training.ib.old, the restore would actually overwrite that database. So if there were any problems, if there were problems with the restore, I'd have big problems because I wouldn't have my other database. That's why you want to rename it to old. When you back up a file, it overwrites any existing backup file in that directory. So if I had a thumb drive with last week's backup and I back up today, last week's backup is overwritten. The file is actually overwritten during the backup process. Okay, so the special situations I started to talk about is there are some utilities in trams for purging old information. As you use trams more and more, trams gathers a lot of information, and there are things that are certainly helpful to have, but they become less and less relevant as time goes on. Some of those things, if we look under utilities and purge, P&R history. If your agency interfaces from a GDS, you might know that the entire raw data from your P&R is actually saved with that invoice. And that's great when you're interfacing or when the invoice is new, if you have any questions about it, because that way you can see the raw data. But after a while, once your ARC report's done, or maybe 6 months later, a year later, there's really no reason for you to have all of that raw data in your database. It becomes irrelevant. You have the invoice information, you don't need the raw data anymore. Well, that data takes up space in your database and it builds up over time. So we have an option to purge P&R history. So you can see here, actually, it automatically assumes 6 months ago, but you can change the date. And if I purge, that information is going to be cleared from the database. If I go up to purge, and you can see I can purge open commission tracking bookings. A lot of agencies will do that. If you have bookings that are over, a year or two old, chances are they were hotels that got canceled or for whatever reason. And you might want to just give up on them because you're not going to collect on a hotel that's 2 years old, or it's unlikely you will. So that actually voids those contract bookings for you to get them out of the way. The change history is a big one that builds up over time. Because in every invoice and every booking, when you click on the history, you can see it keeps a log of who did what, right? You can see here SysDBA. Every time somebody makes a change to an invoice or a record, trams or client base, we're tracking that. And again, that's great information to have. But after a while, it becomes less and less relevant. So we can purge. The thing is, the way the purge works is, think of an Excel spreadsheet. And you have all of these rows of information, right? Well, if you highlight a row and press delete, it clears out all of that information, but it leaves a blank row there, right? So think about that. If you're using Excel, right, you have all those rows, and if you highlight it and just press delete, it clears all the information, but the empty row remains. And trams works the same way. When I purge information, it deletes it, but it leaves a blank row there, a placeholder. One of the things the backup and restore does is when you back up your data, it actually deletes those rows, so you have no more blank rows. It's going to shrink your database. So if you purge information, yeah, you're clearing it, but you haven't really gotten rid of those empty rows. So the backup actually deletes those rows for you. It actually gets rid of them completely, so your database then is complete. It reindexes. Takes everything in there, cleans up those so the searches will be faster. It's not going through all of that empty data. So if you do any of those purges, afterward you want to do a backup and restore. Just back up your database and restore it. Just like we did actually just now. Because that way, again, you're going to have all of your database will be fully shrunk then. Until you do a backup and restore, even though you've cleared out information, the empty rows are still there. So if you do it, otherwise the database size just won't shrink. If you're moving to a new server, I mentioned it's the same steps. You back up the database on the old one and you restore it on the new one. The only thing is you need to make sure that you're using the same or a newer version of Interbase. So right now I'm on Interbase XE, which is the newest version. If I tried to restore to Interbase version 7, I would have problems because the database is newer than the database server. You can go from Interbase 7 on your old computer to Interbase XE, but you need to make sure you're on the same version. And you can do that again by going to Help and About. And you can see here it says Interbase version. I'm on version 10.0.3, so I wouldn't want to restore version 9 or 8 or 7. I can't restore this database because this database is on version 10. If you are restoring to a new version of Interbase or trams and client base, in other words, you backed up on one, in addition to restoring the database, you're going to want to run the database update utilities. And you can find those under all programs and then trams. Trams back office for trams back office, you'll see that there's a TFW update. You want to run that. If you use client base, that's under the trams menu. and you're going to look for the client-based database update. Actually, starting with the next versions coming out, scheduled for the beginning of 2014, there will just be one program to run the update. But if you've gone from an older version of the server to the newer one, you're going to want to run those updates. Okay. I touched on briefly the end user authentication or EUA enabled databases, and I just want to touch on what exactly that means. And the EUA enabling your database allows your agency to take advantage of some more enhanced security and password features. With EUA being enabled on your database, you can require password strength, like passwords have to have a letter and a number. You can make passwords expire, so users have to change them every 60 or 90 days. If you've chosen to turn that on, and our support desk will tell you how to turn on EUA. So if you decide that's something you want your agency to do, our support desk will walk you through it. There are some considerations to take into account. Mostly that you have to have an extra username and password. You don't just have one for the database anymore like I used. You actually have one for the server as well. So you're going to have 2 usernames and 2 passwords. And you need to make sure you know what those are, basically. That's the main consideration for being EUA enabled, but it's a very important consideration. As you can see, backing up your database is not hard because we want you to do it, and we want you to do it often. In fact, it can be quite easy because you can schedule it to run when you're not even paying attention. You do want to check this every so often. You do it like we did now. We went through the test restore when we set this up to make sure it works. And I recommend doing a test restore every few months, maybe every 6 months, maybe every year. But again, just to make sure. Double check those media to make sure the file is showing up and that it has the most recent date on it. Since we overwrite the file, if you're using the same thumb drive every week, you're always going to see your database there. So take a moment, right-click on it, and click Properties. You want to take a peek at it and just make sure that it has the correct date. It should be last modified whenever your last backup was. So if I looked at this and it had last week's date on it, I would know that the backup didn't happen. You want to make sure that this has the most recent time on it.